Okay, so here's your final physiology AP151 lab. This is a lab on genetics. There's no PhysioX activities or lab simulations to do with this lab. You just need to complete this genetics worksheet by midnight Thursday, May 14th. I've uploaded that worksheet to Canvas under this module. You'll also notice it's the same worksheet in your final lab, in your lab packet, so you can work on it that way as well. So let's talk a little bit about genetics. The types of inheritance that we'll talk about are complete dominance, where one allele completely masks the other. And I'll show you an example of what this is. Incomplete dominance is where one allele doesn't completely mask the other, and the result is somewhere in between. Multiple alleles, we'll kind of skip codominance, but multiple alleles, there's more than one allele for a trait, such as in blood typing. And then sex-linked genes will have to do with genes that are located on the X chromosome that get expressed. Incomplete dominance is where one allele doesn't completely mask the other, and the result is somewhere in between. So this can happen with colors of plants or flowers. So let's say the dominant color is red, and this flower is homozygous dominant. That means homo means that their two alleles will both be the dominant allele. And this white flower is homozygous recessive, meaning it has the same alleles, homozygous, but they're both recessive. When we cross them, we'll get the same offspring for all four options in this Punnett square. And the result will be where the dominant red doesn't completely mask the white, we'll just get an in-between kind of purple, lightish color, purple, as the offspring. So that's incomplete dominance, where one allele doesn't completely mask the other. So the dominant recessive doesn't mask the white, but the result is somewhere in between. Then we'll talk about sex-linked inheritance, and I have a couple slides about this. If we look at the comparison of the X and Y sex chromosome, this is the 23rd pair, the X chromosome can hold a lot more genetic material than the Y chromosome. So sex-linked inheritance varies the Mendel number of 3 to 1, which is normally the rate at which you would get a particular recessive trait versus dominant trait, by giving males a 50-50% chance of inheriting the characteristic on the X chromosome. Remember, females, their sex chromosomes, their 23rd pair are XX, and males are XY. So the Y carries little genetic information, mainly those that contribute to male characteristics, but the X carries a lot more genetic information. So if males are carriers to a specific sex-linked inheritance, it'll be on that X chromosome of their XY pair. Genes for certain traits are on the X chromosome, and males only receive one X chromosome, and then they are more likely to inherit disorders passed to from their mother. Women are affected when they get the disorder from both the maternal and paternal grandmother. So what are sex-linked traits? So they're traits controlled by genes, again, located on the sex chromosomes. We call them sex-linked or X-linked because the Y chromosome is so tiny there aren't many genes on it. So the symbol for the allele is attached to an X or a Y. So if we look at a Punnett square for X-linked traits, we'll notice the male and the female are reproducing. So you can see the male at the top with the XY and the female on the side with the XX, that's their sex chromosome. And notice that the alleles are on the sex chromosomes themselves, and those are shown as the superscripts, the little H's that are off to the side of the sex chromosome. So you notice the alleles are only on the X chromosome because they'll hold the majority of the genetic information. And you can see here this is a female heterozygous for a particular trait, and the male, you can see which X, you can see how the X chromosome is carrying that allele. So you can see how when we cross, the options that we would get when we cross. And the only way that this kind of trait, or recessive trait, would get to a male is if it's crossed with this recessive trait on the female. So one male offspring could be affected from inheriting it from its mother. So you'll see here there's a 50-50 chance of a male getting it. So a male has a greater chance of getting that recessive trait versus a female would not have as great of a chance. It could be a carrier of the recessive trait, but the male itself, one male offspring, would be affected in this example. So that's a sex-linked trait. Then an example of a multiple allele are your blood types, and this is a trait controlled by multiple alleles. The alleles in blood type are A, B, and O. And which alleles are dominant? A and B are always dominant, so they will always mask over O if you inherit both an A and an O. Which alleles are recessive? The O is recessive, so the only way you can be type O blood is if you get two O alleles. And which alleles are codominant? A and B are codominant, meaning codominance is kind of part of the multiple alleles because if you inherit both A and B, you could be type AB blood. So multiple allele just means a trait is controlled by multiple alleles, and codominance would be as if you inherit both those alleles and you would have that trait, type AB blood. So this is your genotype, so the alleles that would come together to form your phenotype, which is your blood type. To be blood type A, you would have the AA alleles or the AO alleles, because again, the A is dominant over O. For type B blood, you would have the BB or BO alleles, because B is dominant over O. You can have AB, they can be codominant, so you'd be type AB blood. And the only way to get to be type O blood is if both alleles were O, because it's the recessive. Then we'll finish up with the pedigree chart. And a pedigree chart is a diagram that shows the occurrence and appearance of phenotypes of a particular gene or organism and its ancestors from one generation to the next, most commonly humans, show dogs, and racehorses. And even though our science is extremely advanced, we still use pedigree charts to determine how recessive alleles get passed through generations. So for your last activity on your worksheet, you have to fill out a pedigree chart. You have to determine whether myopia, which is nearsightedness, is dominant or recessive, and then you need to list the genotypes of as many individuals represented by the pedigree as possible. So this is a look, let's just take a look at the pedigree chart itself, kind of ignore the wording around it because this is an example of a problem. Females are expressed by circles and males are squares. And if someone is affected by that recessive trait, it'll be colored in as a darker color. So whenever you see a black shape filled in, that means the person has been affected by that recessive trait. So if you look at this example, because they have 3 kids and only one of them is affected, you know that both the parents are probably heterozygous for that trait. So they would have a dominant and a recessive allele in each parent. Because they have 2 normal kids, they're both heterozygous. Then this person who's homozygous recessive for that trait, so he would express that trait if he reproduces with another female, and then they have, you can see here, their offspring, they get 3 people affected, then this person would most likely be dominant or heterozygous for that specific trait. But we know this person who's affected by it would be recessive, the double lowercase a. If we continue working our way through, you can kind of see the generations are listed by Roman numerals. So these 2 will have these kids, and then the 3rd and then the 4th generation shows that recessive trait is still being passed through. So if we look at the 3rd generation where we have a homozygous dominant, we know that number 2 listed in the 3rd generation must be a carrier. He must be heterozygous because one of their 4 children gets that trait as well. So you'll have to work through this and do the best you can. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to help you. There's videos you could watch on YouTube that also helps you with this. If it helps to fill out Punnett squares that cross each individual with each other, and then you can kind of see where the alleles will show up as you're working through this. If you have any questions, please let me know. This worksheet is due by Thursday at midnight, so please get it done and let me know if you have questions. Thanks, guys.